Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching the Salty Sea, and today I am going to talk about the Warcry metagame in the winter of 2025 in January. I'm very excited for this. It's been a little while since, well, it's always 3 months since the last one. But we've had a surprising number of tournaments given that usually Warcry play kind of slows down in December. Something that I've noticed lately is that uh, this is a subject for another video, but obviously, the hype cycle around Warcry, the rumor mill around Warcry, has made it very difficult to acquire new players. However, the opportunities to play for experienced players and for anyone who stumbles upon the game, if you're watching this for the first time, I'm super happy to have you. The opportunities to play for folks have never really been higher. They've or at least certainly have been very good and very healthy. I think last fall was maybe similar numbers, but the fact that it hasn't dropped off at all, even as sort of GW's support for the game is confusing to say the least, is really impressive and I think is really cool. If we're going to get into actual results, I think the first thing that anyone is going to ask me when they look at this table is what is going on with Slaanesh. Demons of Slaanesh and Slaanesh Sybarites are doing very well, of course. Demons, of course, achieving the magic number for the god. The thing that's going on here is Vexmore goes really well into Slaanesh. Surprise, surprise. And because it fits so well flavor wise, you pretty much never see non-Vexmore lists in Slaanesh. So you just don't see people running the kind of sillier or more off the wall versions of a list that tend to stop a faction from getting up into really high win rates. Something I like to repeat is the numbers can only describe to us how the players are playing. They can't describe some sort of platonic win rate if every faction was to, have its most tuned lists all enter into each other in a massive round robin of, 600 lists that have all been tuned. I would love that, though we're entering a dark society where, maybe soon you'll be able to get an AI program to actually run that for you on TTS, and then you can just play whichever list comes out on top. Let's not think about that right now. Let's think about Slaanesh. So a -1 attack bubble is really good in the current meta. That is something that Vashtis gives you along with Vexmore. And so something like Demons of Slaanesh, because Vexmore gets to be your leader and you don't have to run kind of whatever faction leader you're doing, it becomes a lot easier to also add Vashtis, which then kind of cascades down, and so you can do a lot more with it. Sybarites, the Vexmore synergy is actually a lot more just like random happenstance. Their chaff is very fast. I'll get into more what's going on with those lists in the future, but it's just very easy for them to run things that work well with Vexmore, and so that's really great. Essentially, Slake Slash, other than the Varangard, Slake Slash is the best way to count to 12 in Chaos, and Vexmore's big weakness is that he doesn't really kill dwarves very effectively, and Slake Slash is maybe the best pound-for-pound dwarf killer in the game. Certainly Varangard, maybe even Brute Boss would have things to say about that, but I would put Slake Slash as number one. The other thing that has happened is that Wildercore have absolutely taken over the game. 4 event wins by Wildercore in just the last 6 weeks, which is pretty incredible. Their win rate is incredibly healthy despite being very popular. 102 games and still a 65% win rate is really impressive, especially for a bespoke faction, because something we see a lot of with Wildercore Hunters is that people will just run one box and go 1-3 with them all the time. It happens a lot. And so for them to be having the sustained success that they are means that pretty much every time someone tunes them up, they're doing really well. Or maybe not every single time, but a lot of the time when people run a version of Wildercore that are sort of actually sort of putting a real plan together, they're doing very, very well. And that is really impressive. So Wildercore are doing amazing. The others in that top red situation, Royal Beast Flayers, really haven't been played since there was that popular build with spamming ghouls and the Baron and using pack tactics. Uh, Demons of Nurgle, that win rate is fake. Demons of Nurgle fans are, they only ever build to out of like a sense of a sense of revenge, I think. Every Demons of Nurgle list that I've seen has been like very finely tuned, usually with Vexmore, usually with a lot of Plague Bearers and like a big ally, just like really going for it. You never see just kind of a casual Nurgle list with some flies, things like that. So you can still do well with them, which is pretty cool, but they are nowhere near as good as they used to be, and they're nowhere near as good as those numbers would suggest. They just kind of 35 games deep, not just like a few players, I guess 9 players, but just a few players just kind of going ham with them and doing okay for themselves. And then finally in the red, Ogre Maw Tribes, a little bit more popular, of course, and just a really solid, really scary faction that is usually actually played on the more casual end and still does just as well as it does. One thing to talk about, the last time I did one of these meta videos, I talked about Skaven a lot and how I think that they are the best faction in the game. And few things happened after that video. One is a lot more people started playing Skaven, which is cool. I think a lot of those lists, though, had nothing to do with me saying that they were good in the metagame. A lot of the time when I saw them, they were people just kind of running their favorite models from the Skaventide box set, which is awesome. I think, for a long time, Dominion was the best way to get into Warcry, and I would say that now Skaventide is the best way to get into Warcry. For all of those folks, wishing that there was a starter set for the game, there is now. It's called Skaventide. It comes with a little bit of terrain, about enough terrain for half of a Warcry board, and it comes with 2 warbands and a whole bunch of subs that you can put into those warbands as you mix and match. Although the Stormcast side is a little bit harder to list build with, as Stormcast always are. But back to Skaven. So they became extremely popular. They became very public, and their win rate went up by 1% from 57 to 58. I do think that given how popular they became, being a public faction always drags your win rate down. And so it's actually very impressive that they did as well as they did. But there is a big, big difference between a tuned Skaven list and everything else, because it's so easy to make a bad one with them because so many of their in-house models are unplayable. Monster Killers just keep trucking along, which is great to see. Every time I consider dropping them a tier in my tier list, which I will show later in this video, someone ends up doing really well with them, and so then I figure I want to keep them up where they are. KO, I'm less impressed with KO. A lot of those wins are me. I think their win rate, not me, is 50%. So whether they belong up at the top is questionable, but I'll have them higher than average later on in the video. Dispossessed are, of course, one of the boogie people of the format. Khorne Bloodbound have done just well because a lot of the factions that do what they do better than them have been nerfed. It's plain and simple. And Thunderstrike is really funny because Lumineth is in that exact same boat, by the way. But Thunderstrike is really funny because there are a lot of small tournaments where it's almost entirely one box bespoke lists and then one person with their Thunderstrike, and that person tends to do really well. So Thunderstrike are not nearly as good as their win rate, but they are fine. They're okay. You can definitely play them, but I would say their true win rate is definitely closer to 50%. I mean, 56% is not that far off. Like, for example, if you look at the chi-squared, it's only 1, which basically says that you do not reject the null hypothesis. So you essentially say that they're probably a coin flip and those coins just kind of came up lucky. And I would say that that's probably true. So, for example, Cruel Boys with twice as many games and even 1% lower win rate, the chi-square is actually giving a higher likelihood that coin flips would not create that 55% win rate, essentially, right? So, and that makes sense because I think Cruel Boys are really good. Although that's another one where, like Skaven, tuned Cruel Boys and untuned Cruel Boys are really different. So, getting through the top, let's just talk a little bit about the bottom, anything that jumps out. Iron Golems are really sweet and really fun. They're one of those where, yes, they don't really have the juice in a competitive tournament very much, but remember, there are 60 factions or whatever. The worst factions just don't get played and don't show up on this list. Iron Golems are one of those like fun ones where you can really do some cool stuff, but again, like, if you don't really think about how to set up your iron golems, you are going to kind of struggle. And so that kind of explains why it's all so low. Jade Obelisk with the worst win rate in the game. I made a video once of quote unquote, you're doing it wrong. Bunch of factions that are much better than their win rate. Jade Obelisk was number one there, just because it's mostly that low because there's a couple TOs in the UK who Jade Obelisk is their preferred staff bot, and so when you're TOing as staff bot, you're usually aiming to go 1-3, and people tend to succeed. So that's why it's so low. But Jade Obelisk are pretty good. They're just not in fashion right now, possibly because they kind of feel like Vulcan Flameseekers with fewer tricks. I think they're just as good as Vulcan Flameseekers, but they do have fewer tricks, so that is a thing. However, Chaos Legionnaires right above them really are that bad. That is a rough faction to try to play. Castellites are kind of a weird one where I don't think they're that bad, but there's no one thing that they do really well, and people are not that interested in like the couple ways you can play them to be pretty effective. Something that I've noticed is that people aren't playing Great Heralds in their Castellites lists. Great Herald is by far the best fighter in that faction, bar none, not close. And so if you're not playing a Great Herald, you're probably not going to win because a lot of their synergies and a lot of their points, it's all pointed as if you're going to be just like really turbocharging it with a Great Herald. And so if you're not running that, then you're going to be a little bit disappointed. Let's get into actual tournament wins, though, because I think that's a really interesting stat once you get enough events to actually have some numbers. And we have that now, which is cool. So the first this is where the Wildercore percentages actually get really impressive, which is that Wildercore hunters have 9 championship equivalents across tournaments. For people wondering what that is, I just set a championship equivalent not as first place in a tournament, but as any undefeated run with only one draw. So for example, I went 2 wins and 2 draws I've done that in a couple tournaments actually, and that doesn't count, right? So 3 wins in a draw, 2 wins in a draw, 3-0 and 4-0 are essentially the 4 outcomes that can produce a championship equivalent. So some tournaments produce multiple, some tournaments don't produce any, where like people just all beat each other and get a bunch of draws, and then nobody gets what I would call quote unquote a championship equivalent. You can quibble with the list or not, but the main thing here is it shows who's having, or like what factions are producing really awesome runs through a tournament. And this can tell you a lot, I think. The first one being that Wildercore hunters are doing incredibly well. I've got calculated here a domination percentage, where it's basically how many of the people entering a tournament won that freaking tournament or did something at that tournament that I consider personally to be equivalent to winning it, right? If you go 3 wins and a draw, that's as good as a win to me. If you go undefeated, that's as good as a win to me, right? The rest is like tiebreakers, stuff like that. You couldn't control that very much. So having essentially a third of the people taking that faction win their tournaments is wild given how popular it is. You see the other ones that are above 30%, they all have far fewer people entering. And I think if they were more public factions, if they were more popular factions, they would probably be doing much, much worse. Some of them would still be doing well. I think Slaanesh, both versions of Slaanesh would still win a lot of tournaments. Royal Beast Slayers too, but only if people are kind of really tuning them as far as they can go. Those are certainly really some of the best factions in the game, but Wildercore being so popular and having so many tournaments is incredibly impressive. What Skaven did is also really impressive. This is before they got their update, I think they only had one championship equivalent. So they've basically done 4 in the last 5 months, which is for the number of Warcry events that are out there, that's pretty strong. And so they've gone from a very low percentage to 16%. For reference, the number that would be kind of average here, I think, is about 9%. So, something like Cruel Boys is exactly average here, right? So most of these at the top are very, very high. Obviously, Vulcan Flame Seekers, they're incredibly popular and, very hard to win a tournament with them. But 2 people have, just because so many people have entered tournaments with Vulcan Flame Seekers. That's just going to happen. So Skaven is really impressive, and if it weren't for how ridiculously successful Wildercore hunters have been, I would be very impressed about Skaven and really talking about them. Again, like, I really called my shot in my last video, being like, Skaven are incredible, people need to try them, and they were, but I really overlooked a kind of sleeping bear that was getting ready to come out in the winter. That is the opposite of what bears do, but you get what I'm talking about. The other thing I want to talk about here is Soulblight Gravelords. Soulblight is an incredibly popular faction, 44 tournament entries in this meta since the last sort of realm-shaking FAQ. But the interesting thing here is Soulblight's win rate is not very high. It's 48%. That's negative, right? But when people do kind of pick Soulblight and build it correctly for the event that's on hand, they win. Soulblight is incredibly good at winning tournaments, even if it's not very good at winning games, if that makes sense. Like, some tournaments just turn out to be the perfect Soulblight tournament where there's just a ton of objectives and your resurrections are really strong and you're able to kind of cheat the win conditions of certain missions with Soulblight's resurrection mechanic, and you're able to just kind of win a tournament because Soulblight is the perfect faction for that tournament pack, right? That just kind of happens with Soulblight. So if you care about winning tournaments, or if you just care about having a good time, just know that Soulblight's not off the table. People are doing really well with it. The issue with Soulblight, you don't want to be just on like a low model count. It's really tempting now that the chaff has been nerfed to kind of lower your commitment to said chaff. Like, normally a lot of the old Soulblight lists, they've essentially lost like 1.5 models. And it's much better to just say, okay, I lost 1 model for my old list and I'll have to downgrade one of them, than it is to say, all right, these aren't as efficient anymore. I'm actually going to kind of respec into these other models that are comparatively better. The nerf wasn't enough to close that gap. The chaff is still better. And the reason just being that resurrection mechanic where you can just waste people's time forcing them to kill your chaff. You can still motor your chaff around the board you still have all the same abilities. You still have Shambling Horde. So Soulblight still wants to play the same way it did with these like 12, 13 model lists. And that's how sometimes tournaments will just like open up to you. So the place where you need to sacrifice is, maybe you have 1 less model than you would have had before, but you don't go down to like 4 fewer models. You instead, if you have to sacrifice a little bit of hitting power, you do that instead of sacrificing the thing that makes Soulblight really good. Finally, the last thing that I think is really worth talking about with this kind of championship equivalence versus win rates, we do not see Stormcast here. At all. I think Warrior Chamber and Thunderstrike both have 1 championship equivalent, but with how popular they are, 20 players have taken Thunderstrike. I don't know how many people. I guess Warrior Chamber isn't that popular, but a lot of people take Black Talons, or at least enough people that it adds up, right? 10 on Ruination, 8 on Black Talons, 19 on Quester Soulsworn, right? These numbers all add up to where you would really think at this point that people would have won some tournaments with Stormcast Eternals, and we just do not see it at all. And so, yes, Thunderstrike, people do well in tournaments where there's 1 box bespoke warbands hanging out, but those people don't win. Someone ends up beating them before the end. So I think that's really fascinating. I almost want to try to go and run Stormcast in a tournament. So I can really key in on some of the reasons why that is. Personally, I think that they just really struggle on certain missions if your opponent has a competitive warband. Like, I just think there's a real ceiling on certain missions where there's a floor too. Like, it can be very difficult to play against Stormcast if you have just like a collection of models and you have to play them on a mission that they're decent at, and you don't have the ability to like overwhelm them with numbers or crack through the armor. Like, you really need to do one of those two against Stormcast. But I think that most tuned warbands are going to be able to do one or the other. And so I just think there's this real ceiling on Stormcast. I have some ideas for how you can use the new battle trait to get around that, but that really doesn't, I still don't think that that really brings them into the very top, and I think it's really fascinating that they haven't won a single tournament. I mean, sorry, they have won a couple, but like they don't have any of these sort of repeated championships at all. I think that that's like should really should really worry you about them. Something that I said, and I was speaking from an emotional place when they nerfed Thunderstrike, was that this essentially removes them from competitive play, and I ended up maybe kind of regretting that at first once I saw, what their win rate was looking like after, like in my last meta video, after seeing kind of a lot of people playing them and seeing what that win rate was. But once we had enough events for me to track who's winning events and what factions are, and it feeling a little bit less like just random noise, I think it's wild that Stormcast can't win events, and I think it's a little concerning too. So I definitely have gone from regretting that statement to feeling pretty good about it and feeling like that they have been removed from competitive play, which I'm not willing to totally give up on them yet. I really do think that there's some good stuff you can do with the Armor Boys, but yeah, tough times, and especially for some of the worst Stormcast chambers, like, my poor squatted Sacrosanct are just, I don't even know what to do with those models now. Anyway, let's move on to allies. And battle traits have been really cool for the game, and I've almost been thinking about not tracking allies anymore or like Underworld's warbands and just kind of the stuff that's in lists anymore, because battle traits in theory do a lot to help balance the game, and that you don't have to run an ally in order to win. But there's only, I don't know, 10 battle traits that are good out of the 60 factions. Most of the battle traits are pretty bad, and so they don't really tempt me into getting rid of allies for most of the factions, and that's okay. But so it is still worth tracking, I think. And one of the things that's really interesting that it reveals is that, yes, Vexmore is still very good. It's wild how popular the Thricefold Discord are, and how they still manage to have a 61% win rate. You see Vexmore or Vastus or both put into all sorts of, I hate calling people's lists bad, because some people put like part of their identity in their lists, and so they feel like when you call their list bad that you're calling them bad. But let's just call them non-competitive lists. You see a lot of non-competitive lists where they've put Vexmore in because they've heard Vexmore is really good, and then the rest of the warband is kind of unfocused and not really doing anything, if we're being honest. And those lists tend not to do very well. And so it's wild just how well any kind of list that has generally pretty good models in it, and then you add Vexmore, just how well those lists are doing. I know a lot of the kind of real competitive obsessives of the game have kind of moved on from Vexmore, I think just out of boredom, but that doesn't make it any less good, and people who play with it are still really crushing it. It's just wild how good it is. There are some popular order choices that are really not doing well, which I think is interesting. Calthea Zandire has a negative win rate. Kixitaka and Co. have a negative win rate. Hexbane's Hunters have a negative win rate. And these are a lot of the really popular choices from kind of a previous meta. Basically, if you are hoping that a cool triple will help your pile of order dudes do well, I think you're going to have a bad time. Order in general, other than Gunlines and Dispossessed, is kind of struggling as an entire faction. A lot of the things that Order likes to do just don't really work. Dwarves are fine, but other than that, Order it's like it's you run guns, you run dwarves, and the rest of order is having a tough time. And it really shows with some of the kind of plug and play order allies, the really popular order allies, that 48% is not bad, right? But for the ally that's supposed to be, this is the really good thing that fixes everything, to be struggling like that is, I think, very telling. Now, there are some order allies that are very popular that are doing well. So, for example, errant questers are doing okay, and annihilator primes are a little bit more medium than that, but they're still doing solid. And the Soulblight Knight Relictor, right, is essentially an errant quester with a shooting attack. You just have a little less strength and a little more shooting, and that one's doing pretty well, right? Sort of technically a higher win rate, but when you look at like popularity, of course, the more public thing always has a lower win rate because just the types of people taking it, right? If you're going to take a Knight Relictor, it's probably because you are purposefully being fancy, and fancy people just tend to do well. Another thing to talk about, going back to Soulblight Gravelords for a second, you see a lot of their sort of Underworld's warbands here, and the one that's doing really well is the Exiled Dead. I think if you do want to leverage Soulblight Gravelords, starting with the Exiled Dead and then putting in a lot of the other chaff is a really good place to be, just a small thing. But the next one is I Bring Damage is still really good. So the things that bring just a lot of damage are just doing generally very well. So FOMO Crushers are doing very well for Chaos. Varanguards are also doing pretty well. The Dread Pageant wins a lot of games basically on the back of Slake Slash, although part of that is just because of you mostly see the Dread Pageant in Slaanesh Sybarites. There's a little bit of it outside of Sybarites, but it's mostly inside of Sybarites, and Sybarites are doing very well. But you see a lot of pure damage choices, just like they just hit hard, right? Clawbacks. You see a lot of those choices just doing really, really well because just Warcry is still in a place where damage is king. Damage is the most powerful thing you can do, and the second most powerful thing to do is have lots of activations, and that's just kind of where we're at, right? The third most powerful thing is having a lot of range, and if you're Wildercore hunters and you get to have all three, that's really impressive too, right? So we are seeing just big damage doing extremely well. You don't see ogres on the list because they kind of split the vote, right? All the ogre leaders, people basically like can't decide which one to take when they reach for an ogre leader. So, but all of them are doing really well. And since they all kind of have the same role, they essentially, I think you could combine them and just that incredible win rate is just to be expected, right? I think most competitive players will tell you that the Gut Lord is the best one. I wouldn't take the fact that the Crusher has a higher win rate as being weird or contradicting that at all. I do think Crushers are generally underutilized, but what we're actually seeing here is just it's low sample size. They all have the exact same. They all have the exact same role, so it's just like all of them are so good at that role. I think that the Gut Lord is definitely overtuned, but I think the best way to kind of, if you were going to be kind of the game developer here, you would really want to do the +1 attack blessing because that's what Gut Lord and Crusher are both using every time they get taken, and that would kind of tamp them both down a little bit. Tyrant, I don't know what we do with Tyrant in that situation because people usually aren't blessing their Tyrants, and Tyrants are pretty crazy too. So just a thing to keep in mind if you're brewing your destruction warbands is having a giant damaging leader is really useful. Brute bosses are doing fine. Brute boss is kind of the techie ally for destruction. Those are pretty good too, but man, it just seems like keeping it simple and just going for a giant thing is just like, it's just being rewarded every single time. That finally gets us to the tier list, and I'm going to take a little pause. The pause is so that you can kind of digest what's going on the screen. There are a lot of factions these days. It is wild. I'm not going to talk about every one, but we'll get through a few of them. So first, an Emilio Estevez tier. I have Wildercore. It's silly at this point. It would just be obtuse of me to put them anywhere else. They have proven themselves. I think, before this winter, before the Wildercore winter, I had them in S tier, but they were kind of at the bottom of S tier. I mean, I gave them their due respect. Any faction in S tier, I am giving them real respect here, right? But I didn't have them as the number one faction in the game. But Wildercore people, Wildercore players, they've proven it. They've gone out there, they've done the work, they've beaten their opponents. I don't know what else there is to say. Every single build of Wildercore, I'll get into it more later, but every single build has done well. And so there's nowhere else you can put them other than right at the top. I'm mostly putting Skaven number 2 under stubbornness here. You could really argue, I would say any of these four, you could argue that they should be number 2. I do think that Dispossessed is the bottom of S tier. I think that Dispossessed has some real problems. If you go back to tournament wins, for example, Dispossessed is just much lower than the other S tier factions, just because it's actually very hard to win a tournament with Dispossessed. There's a lot that can go wrong. They're a little like Stormcast, except they're actually good. And they usually run a couple Stormcast. They're actually nothing at all like Stormcast, but in terms of that issue of it just being really hard to go 4 wins in a row with them, they suffer from that issue. There's not much else to say. But when you get stuck against Dispossessed, where the mission favors them, it can just feel incredibly hopeless. And so putting them anywhere other than S tier just feels wrong. Talking about the bottom is kind of fun, where it's wild. It's basically elves and Khorne is what the bottom is, and that's just kind of what our game is. If you're Khorne, you're just not allowed to have good abilities. Khorne Bloodbound also have terrible abilities, but Blood Reavers are so good that it's fine, and Korgoraths are so good, and the Underworlds team is so good, right? Like they have real tools. They have some leaders that aren't completely embarrassing, with the Slaughter Priest and the Wrathmaster and, the Exalted Deathbringer and Drom. The list goes on and on, actually. Like there's a lot of Khorne leaders that aren't good enough where you would ally them in really in a different warband, but they are good enough that if you're just like, this is my leader, he's 10 points overcosted, it's fine, the rest of my warband's pretty good, you're going to be fine, right? But the other Khorne warbands are just not that. And it's really funny that some people complain that Khorne is too much of a Johnny army in AOS. Khorne is the exact opposite in Warcry, where they just have nothing intelligent going on between the ears in any of their 3 iterations in this game. And like I said, Bloodbound gets away with it, but oh boy, do Demons and Claws of Karanak not get away with it. So that bottom there is Elves and Khorne. I would love to see Elves and Khorne fixed at some point, please. I would much rather see Elves and Khorne fixed than this top bracket here fixed. I mean, if it had to come down to it, because like this is just so much more dire. It's so wild. Everything in C tier has real potential. You could like play, you can play Warcry with it. You can really do actual stuff with it. Sure, I don't think it'll ever have like a really high win rate in tournaments, but like they're playing the game. These ones down here are not playing the game. There are some things in Ideneth, if you only use their weird Underworlds warbands, you can put a team together, but even then I don't think it's ever going to be a tuned warband from these things. Because there's kind of too many factions to kind of talk about each individual one as far as the top of the metagame, I wanted to kind of zoom in a little bit. This group here at the top is all the ones where I'm kind of nervous when I play them, essentially, is how I would think about it. The tiers, there's that. This stuck in the middle with you tier is just the ones where they're just too good. I refuse to put them in C tier. They're not threatening any tournaments. For example, even like Cities of Sigmar Castellites are one of the lowest win rates in the game. Jade Obelisk are the lowest win rate in the game, but like there's so much juice there, you can't put them in C tier. They are bad, but they're not like bad. Like I would not make fun of someone at a tournament for running them. I wouldn't make fun of someone for running any of the other ones either, but I wouldn't be like, oh, cool, you're running Sylvaneth. Whereas like, if you see someone running Nurgle Mortals, you're like, oh, cool, man, you're running Nurgle Mortals, which is the sort of kindest the kindest diss you can ever give someone. I don't know. You see it all the time though when someone brings a faction that no one thinks can do anything. People are always like really interested in the fact that they've done so. Getting back here, I do think that these top two tiers are a cut above, but you can kind of tune up these other ones in Backstreet Boy tier where you can kind of take aim at a few of these and beat a few of them. And so, what are you taking aim at? I really think there's just 5 warbands really that matter, and all of these sort of factions can kind of just be distilled into one of them. I ran these by my patrons before I recorded, and after much discussion, they said really there's only 3. I still think there's 5, but we'll get through it, and you'll see why some folks will say there's really only 3. The first one is Destruction Truck Rally. There's really just 2 things going on here. Huge, overwhelming violence from the leaders. I already showed you the win rates for various ogres, for example. You want to play a hero where if you get a rampage in round 2 or round 3, the game is over on the spot. Like a rampage 4s, 5s, 6s, right? I think the odds of doing that in round 2 are like 17% to get a 4-up rampage, and then you get another 17% chance in round 3, and it's so nice to just have like what 17% is just barely more than 1 in 6, right? So you just have these 2 1 in 6 shots at just like the game is over, your opponent has no say, it's just a free win, right? And if you can pick up free wins without having to actually play well, that's a really nice thing to be able to do in any kind of strategy game, and Destruction Truck Rally can absolutely do it. The second thing that you want to have is extremely high utility chaff, and this is where I kind of think of Truck Rally as being really different from Vexmore and Skaven, where destruction is for nerds in this game. It's not at all how it is in AOS. If this is one of your first videos and you are coming here from Age of Sigmar, just know that Warcry plays really differently, and Destruction's whole thing is we have the highest damage output and we have the best abilities, and we basically have everything. What they don't have is like, it's not usually really easy to like spam. Well, it kind of is. People don't do it though because the high damage stuff is so good. But basically, they have the best abilities in the game. So whether you are taking Shank, who has that net that's on a 2-up instead of a 3-up, whether you are taking Eggs, whatever it is you're doing, whether you're taking Gut Rippas, which have the amazing reaction, but they also have just like incredible durability. They're just so good at playing defense. Or you take Noblars, which are just so ridiculously cheap. There's just a lot you can do with chaff in Destruction. Even the worst Destruction warbands kind of have stuff to do with that. But it just like, it allows you to do so many things in those games where you don't get a random instant win due to one of your big guys. And so that lets you not only do you not have to outplay your opponent because you get random free wins, but also if push comes to shove, you do have tools if you need to outplay your opponent. So it's just like you really get the best of both worlds if you're playing kind of the tuned destruction lists that can do that. The other thing that you get is kind of this optional ranged presence where you can either have like a Bolt Boy boss or harpoons. Monster killers are really complicated because they can be built in either direction here, where you can make a Truck Rally list with Monster Killers, or you can make an Activation Dom list with Monster Killers. But one of the things, if you're Truck Rallying, you can take harpoons and have kind of this ranged element too, where you can just kind of literally do everything at once with your warband, and that is very powerful. Similar to this, but a little different, is Vexmore synergies, where Vexmore is just, it's the one thing in Chaos. Other FOMO Crushers are still there, but it's the one thing in Chaos other than a FOMO Crusher that can actually like kind of hang with the best points efficient high damage things in other Grand Alliances until Skaven came along. And it's the one non-Skaven thing in Chaos that can really like impress you on a point for point fighting basis, right? And so what you do is you just take Vexmore, but Vexmore is a very weird model that has a lot of big strengths and a lot of really big weaknesses. So then the whole rest of your warband has to be papering over Vexmore's weaknesses, and then you really go into turbo drive. So the first thing you want is a fast threat that is bigger than Vexmore. So the two best are Slake Slash and Varangard, but there's plenty of others in Chaos. The Ogrid Myrmidon counts. The all of the like Blood Kinds and Doom Bowls in Beasts of Chaos count. Even the like Aviarch from Tzeentch kind of counts. It's so much worse than the other top options that you never see it, but that can do it for you, right? You can do a lot of that kind of stuff, and then after that, you just want cheap chaff, preferably fast chaff, because again, Vexmore is so slow that it just kind of takes a very small just sphere of the tabletop and dominates that, but then the rest of your warband has to orbit around it, right? And so some cheap fast chaff is really nice to have. You usually can fill that out in about 700 750 points, and so you get a little bit of optional silliness that you can put in, because Vexmore is a very straightforward fighter, not a lot of kind of thinky fancy pieces to it, and a lot of the things that you need to run in order to make up for Vexmore's deficiencies, they're also just very straightforward. Like, I sprint and I hit, and that's all that they do, right? And so usually people end up spending those last 250 points on like some kind of silly utility piece. I don't want to call them silly. Some of them are legitimately good. I mean, I think Vashtis is pretty good. Some people like Great Bray Shaman. Some people like, there's all sorts of various wizards in Chaos that do stuff, whether you want like a Chaos Sorcerer Lord that does stuff. They all do stuff, and which one you want to play is totally up to you. None of them are very good on their own, but they're like serving this role where your warband doesn't do anything tricksy, doesn't do anything to put the opponent off balance. Your only disruption is damage. And so it can just be nice to have another piece that does something besides just damage. And so that can be really good. If you don't want to do that, you can just take more threats and chaff, and that works out fine. So we do see Vexmore in a lot of lists where it's just Vexmore, and then the list doesn't have any of this stuff. None of the chaff is particularly cheap. There's nothing bigger than Vexmore, and those lists tend not to do well. But when you actually build around the model, Vexmore is just as good as it's ever been. Just because there's other things that are more fashionable right now does not mean they're better than Vexmore. It is absolutely crazy. Then we get into the activation DOMs, and this one's kind of complicated, but basically there's 5 armies that do this really well, and I think the best at it is Dispossessed. Then you also have Beast Flayers, Soulblight, Mastakillas, and Wildercore. Wildercore is complicated, but their doggy build is essentially just copying Royal Beast Flayers, and it is very good. I kind of underestimated it for a long time because I think the crossbow build is better, but the doggy build is kind of like almost as good at as Beast Flayers is at doing that thing. Basically what you need is cheap chaff, and you want to run as much of it as you can, and then you just need a very silly mechanic that completely exploits having the last word. So, for example, Royal Beast Flayers and Wildercore have pack tactics, and I think it's just called kill or something, right? But the kill order for Wildercore is where you have all your dogs bite them. Those two are really good if your opponent has run out of models, and then you have like 4 activations to just swamp one thing with dogs or swamp one thing with ghouls, and then just like hit your pack tactic. And then if you win initiative on the next round, you basically win on the spot because, like, for example, Beast Flayers, you could put your leader into one of their chaff models while also swarming their important target with ghouls. And then if you win initiative, your leader just kills one of their chaff, and then you deal another 12 damage, and you've dealt essentially 24 damage without them being able to activate at all. And so that can kind of get you a free win on the spot. And again, just like with Destruction Truck Rally, anytime you can just get a free win without actually having to match wits with your opponent, that's really important. And it doesn't make you a worse player for doing it. It's just like the best players find situations where they don't have to be the best players. That's just in every strategy game, that's one of the best ways to win. Soulblight has their resurrections that also, when you're resurrecting things at full health, like skellies come back at full health, and you just have so many bodies. Tarantulos can kind of do a slightly less good but still awesome impersonation of this. You again get to just like really waste your opponent's time, where they have to work really hard to just get a kill, and then you always get to essentially treat their kill as a teleport, where you can just put your model wherever you want. You can take it from where it died, and then you can just plop it down anywhere. And then, of course, now that Resurrection has been nerfed, the sort of drawback is that you can't activate, but you're not being punished for not being able to activate because the round's over anyway and you're already where you want to be. So that's just really, really good. Dispossessed and Beast Flayers work a little different. They're both kind of dipping their toe into this truck rally theme too, where in Dispossessed and Beast Flayers, you have to run a couple offensive models. Beast Flayers, luckily, their leader does it, but you'll often sometimes see them running an additional ally who hits hard. Dispossessed are pretty much always running either like a Stormcast ally, or there's like a few fighters in order like the Medusa, or a couple others like Knave Black Talon, I guess, is a Stormcast as well, but a couple things that are not the most points efficient, but they can both move and hit, and so they're useful in Dispossessed. But you run like a couple heavy hitters, and then you wait a whole bunch, and now your opponent is having to really commit to their strategy before you have to commit, and then you both have your reaction. If they kill you, you get to get a bonus action, or you have your just eat an objective and just take the objective ability. And if you do that early, they can react to it and try to take down the thing that you ate the objective with. But if you get to do it late, you get to choose the objective and you get to choose which one you want to just eat. And that's incredibly powerful. So these warbands all just like, they win by having the last word. And if you have a warband that doesn't have a lot of bodies, you're going to be in a huge disadvantage unless you have a lot of different ways to reduce their numbers early in the first 2 rounds, and then you can beat them. You'll see some people sometimes give up on like the highest end of damage in their Truck Rally or their Vexmore lists so that they can have more things that do damage, so that they can actually beat these activation DOMs. And I think that's often worth it, even if sometimes you'll be disadvantaged in kind of the pseudo mirror, right? The Truck Rally mirror usually favors whoever brought the biggest truck. Wilder Guns is another one of these. Basically, every full commit build of Wilder Core is winning a lot. Doggos are an activation DOM, but the other 2 builds for Wilder Core are crossbow spam. And then you can be playing either strategy and just have one of your deployments be an Arbalester deployment. An Arbalester deployment is just an Arbalester plus a bodyguard. So whether it's like just the spears that come with Wilder Core, where you put 2 spears next to it, they're going to rush in. They're probably going to try to take out the Arbalester first, and then your spears just kind of, they get in the way, and they have range 2, so the opponent can't get around them. And so just like you chip damage them with the spears and get in the way with the spears so that your Arbalester can keep just annihilating them. Hunters of Huanchi and KO are both pretty good factions in this game, but I do think they're just kind of worse versions of Wilder Core. I play a lot of KO. I love playing KO. I've got to be honest, most of the ways I play KO are just slightly worse versions of the Arbalester version of Wilder Core. Hunters of Huanchi are really good. They're really, really good. I have a lot of respect for that faction, but you can't convince me that they're not just a worse version of Wilder Core. However, I will say the playstyle matters a lot. You have to protect the Arbalester, like I said, with something. And the crossbows need to be really keeping the opponent at arm's reach and being very sort of tactical about which order you put them in, because you want to have your reaction open when they come and close the gap, so that you can just, both Hunters of Huanchi and Wilder Core have this reaction where you get to get a bonus disengage if they didn't one-shot kill you. And with the 12 wounds on Wilder Core, you have a decent chance that they won't be able to do it. And so then you just want to be able to bounce off of them so that you can still shoot and waste more of their actions. Skaven, finally, my my folks wanted to call them Destruction Truck Rally too, but basically you want to be using the most out of the battle trait and the overtuned new guy. So the battle trait says that you get to return two 70-point fighters, one in round 3 and one in round 4, the beginning of those rounds. And then also the Rat Ogre is just wild. So you need to have at least one Rat Ogre and at least two 70-point fighters. I think one of them should be a Packmaster. I can see reasons to do what are they called? Clan Rats instead of Packmasters for your other 70-pointers, because Clan Rats are just, the toughness 4 is just much nicer than what Packmasters are bringing to the table when they're not doing crazy things with Rat Ogres. But the real thing there is after that, you get to kind of put your own stamp on it, as long as you're bringing some 70-pointers and a Rat Ogre. So like your leader, there's a few different leaders that are reasonable in my opinion. Like you could take a Master Molder, you could take Skabic, you could take Scritch, you could take one of the Death Masters. I think all of those are very reasonable. I even would accept a Grey Seer, right? But then those choices dictate your actual playstyle. In general, I think that Skaven are usually better as being played as kind of a late game value army, where they're really broken if you can let the board spread out and then put a Rat Ogre somewhere where it can pinball among a whole bunch of things that can't take it one-on-one. The second your Rat Ogres get stuck against something that can actually fight them one-on-one, that's when they're in trouble. And it can be tough if they take a lot of damage early. But you can also build Skaven lists, say with a bunch of Storm Vermin, where the idea is to go straight into them early, and your Storm Vermin are toughness 5, and if their warband can't clear toughness 5 off the board, then you just win that way. So there's certainly a bunch of different ways to play it, as long as you stick to having at least two 70-point fighters and at least one Rat Ogre. So let's look at some examples real quick. Destruction Truck Rally and Vexmore, of course, are similar. Here's one Vexmore list by Krister Carlson, which I think is very instructive, where you see it's just a lot of gores. It's just a lot of gores. So there's a Vanguard, there's a Great Bray, but it's just a lot of gores, right? So you've got your bigger thing than Vexmore, a bunch of fast chaff, your one fancy thing, and you've got Vexmore, and that's it. And it's simple, and Krister won a tournament with it. Then you have Christian P here with a Destruction Truck Rally list, and this is a lot of the stuff where you get to have extremely high utility chaff and you get to get very fancy. Brugits have mostly fallen out of favor, but the people who run them are doing well. They have a very good win percentage. There's the Crusher here because you want your Ogre ally. Then there's just a bunch of fancy people. Christian is running a Rockgut Troggoth, which almost everyone who ran a Rockgut Troggoth has done poorly, but Christian won this tournament, so well done to them. And you just see here, like, every bit of chaff here is either very good at defense or ridiculously cheap or has a net or just like has a crazy ability. It's wild what Destruction can bring to the table here as far as the sort of work that their chaff can do. As you can tell, like, Chaos has none of that ability. Then if we go to activation DOMs and Wilder Guns, here's my sort of worst Wilder Guns list that I went undefeated, well, a complicated undefeated with. Much love to all you guys in Madison. But it was just a whole bunch of Arcos, two Thunderers as my bad Arbalesters, and then just a few bodyguards, right? So I had the Endrin Master to bodyguard, the Fumigator, and then the Runefather with the range 2, because the Thunderer with the Deck Sweeper has the minimum range, so you can kind of get up in its face. So that's why I wanted the range 2 fighter to bodyguard that one. And then just a Reclusium Prime to just be a heavy hitter. But mostly here, we're just trying to shoot, and we're trying to punish the opponent for closing the gap. And that's all we're doing. And just really simple. And this is a really good example of just a bad Wildercore list. KOR, just bad Wildercore, but they're really fun, and I do enjoy it. I think it's a really fun play style, and you can do just this but stronger in Wildercore. Servant of Fantasy won it was, yes, a more casual tournament. I think Servant would tell you that, but they just crushed everybody that they played, and it was all eggs and the Beast Knob and then 2 harpoons. So the way eggs work is your first couple eggs really don't do that much. They're not very points efficient. A lot of 60-point chaff is better. But then when you have a million eggs, your opponent can't move without having to risk that chance of getting frozen in place getting netted by the egg's reaction. And then they also take a little bit of damage from that. So every single time your opponent moves, you get to react, as long as you just have a million more fighters than them. So as long as you outnumber them by at least like 3, you should be able to shut them down if they're kind of a foot slogging, not very fast warband. And then you get to sort of double it up on them by just harpooning the hell out of them, which is really wild. And then like your Beast Knob can actually do some fighting for the things, harpoons are really good at killing a thing you need to kill, but they're not very good at killing lots of things. And so that's where your Beast Knobs can step in. And so this is just like a very simple and very like, it's a very silly looking kind of spam list, but it is a very powerful list, and it's no joke. And a slightly less meme version of this went undefeated at Adepticon last year. Here's some slightly less extreme versions of these archetypes, because those were both pretty extreme. But for example, Pyotr Lewandowski, I hope I pronounced that right, went with, like, you can see it's kind of interesting here. One deployment was all Trailblazers with crossbows. One deployment had an Arbalester and a couple spears to protect it. One was just like kind of some stuff. And I assume that this was probably a tournament where your shield came on round 2 a lot. And so Pyotr was able to win a tournament with like a much less meme version of Wielder Guns, but using all the pieces that are really good and using kind of both of the philosophies here, where you're kind of doing crossbow spam and Arbalester deployments, which is really powerful. Then Guile won a tournament with a slightly less all-in version of Soulblight. Usually you're seeing Soulblight succeed when they run a ton of models. This one was just 10, but you had like a little bit of things that could do what I said before, as far as really punishing the opponent for giving you the last word. So that White King, for example, is not capable of going toe-to-toe with big damage dealers. And so it really wants to go last so that it can go and pick the fight it wants to pick and not have the opponent respond. And so here in a list with 10 models, that's much more likely to actually happen, which is kind of nice. Gorath is another one where Gorath is really bad if they hit him before he gets to hit them. And so when Gorath gets to have the last word, he's very, very strong. So yes, this is only 10 models. You won't always have the last word, but when you do, you get to absolutely punish your opponent. And I bet that's mostly what happened for Guile at this tournament, and they ended up winning. Finally, the relative kind of newcomer to these sort of archetypes is Skaven. Here is a list that Robert Viscomi won I think it was a TTS league with, and he went with Skabic and Scritch to get both of their ability suites, which is kind of interesting, and then a Lurking Skaven to be the thing for Scritch to resurrect, and then of course just the classic combo Rat Ogre, Packmaster, really good. I think it's super easy to make a bad Skaven list, but if you kind of look at the formula that Rob has kind of created here, I think it's really easy to do. One thing that I think is really interesting, I talked a lot in my last meta video about how, me and Andy Morris, who is an incredible player in the UK, we kind of swapped a lot of Skaven ideas back and forth, and both brought what we thought was like our best first draft to a TTS league, and we ended up meeting in the finals of that league, and it was a really happy moment for me, because it was like our work had paid off and our theory crafting had paid off and we'd really proven it. Rob just went and said, okay, I see your lit, because I had a Scritch, very like resurrection heavy, almost like Soulblight Gravelords, but in Skaven kind of list. And Andy had a Skabic kind of damage over time list, where it was, because Skabic has those delayed damage abilities, and then he just had a couple other killy things, like he had I think the ninja with the shooty attack, for example. And Rob just said, okay, I see these two lists, I'm just going to mash them together. And he won a tournament with that, right? Which I think is a cool way to iterate on what other people are doing. So those are kind of some examples of how to sort of slide into each of these archetypes. But for a lot of folks, that framework will kind of annoy you. A lot of people hate being put into boxes. I think that boxes and frameworks are just a really good way to simplify very complex problems. All models are wrong, but some models are useful, essentially. But for people who feel boxed in, let me present to you with Backstreet Boy Tier. This is where there are a lot more playstyles than the 5 playstyles I just outlined and the ways that those win. I think that because of the mechanics of Warcry, having the thing that does the most damage efficiently, not necessarily the most damage efficient, but like the biggest damage output that is also fairly efficient, has always been top tier in Warcry. Whatever the most powerful thing to do with the last word is, combined with the best fighters at getting the last word, has always been very powerful in Warcry. I think those two things will always be good. Whatever the best ranged list is in Warcry has always been at least pretty good. Those kind of three concepts will always be really powerful in this game, but there are other things that you can do that are pretty good that maybe, only need a little bit of help to get over the edge. And a lot of these factions are very good at that. So, for example, there's a lot of strike and fade kind of factions here where you can sort of use terrain and you kind of like stay safe and then you strike, and you need to kill them when you strike, but you can kind of, if you achieve that, you can stay safe and keep doing that. So, for example, Corvus Cabal, Sylvaneth, Night Haunt are all quite good at that kind of play style. That's a play style that works really well if your meta has a lot of bespoke warbands because the wound pools aren't too big, and so you can really like cripple them and then get out and not take a lot of damage back, right? There's also a lot of things here with offensive chaff. So, for example, Khorne and Khorne is kind of a mix. They're kind of trying to do Destruction Truck Rally. They're just not as good at it as the Destruction Warbands are. Same is true, I think, with Spire Tyrants, where they are definitely truck rallying, where they have that that utility netter chaff, but they're not quite as good. So it's fine. They're still really good, but they're not quite on that level. But offensive chaff, like what Lumineth does, what Dark Oath is different. What Vulcan Flame Seekers does, is kind of a thing you can try to do. This is something that Scions of the Flame does, is they're really focused on trying to get as much damage in with their chaff as they possibly can. That's never been the best thing, although it was pretty good in 1.0. So maybe offensive chaff will come back one day, but right now, just the way the points paradigm is in Warcry 2.0, it's always just taken a step back. You can run Ironjaws as a very offensive chaff warband as well, and it can be pretty fun to do. So there's a lot of stuff you can do that as far as a different play style. You can do Stormcast as kind of a mid-range control setup. You can also do it as just mid-range aggro setup, actually, and you can do Ironjaws as mid-range control or mid-range aggro as well. And yes, those aren't going to be at the very top of the meta, but they can be very good. And they haven't won any tournaments, but they're okay. Ironjaws did win, I think, post nerf. Ironjaws has won a tournament, or maybe even two. They're very, very popular, and the win rate is not very high, but some people have spiked with them. I think Ironjaws can do a really good job countering, and unfortunately, the 5 playstyles I talked about at the S tier do a really good job countering this too. But something that a lot of people like to run, especially a lot of experienced players who maybe aren't the most cutthroat players, like to run is like 3 chaff models, 1 model that hits reasonably hard, and then like 3 or 4 fancy specialists with cool abilities that kind of make you feel smart for playing them. I love the folks who run these kinds of warbands. They are very, very exploitable by a lot of the top stuff, and like Skaven exploits this really well. And Ironjaws, I think, exploits it even better than Skaven does, because like these types of warbands, they really need to wait once with their chaff model to let the board develop, and then they can start using their fancy abilities to get value. They can't like kick things off, but they also aren't invested enough in chaff models to actually force anybody to wait with them, which is why you can pretty much never beat like the truck rally lists with them. But you can also never beat Ironjaws, even though they're not really playing a truck rally, because they have that battle trait that hard counters it. Seraphon, the hunt for the perfect Seraphon warband continues. People keep trying, and I love them for it. Man, in theory, Croxagores are really good. In theory, the Star Master is really good. The chaff is not very good, but one chaff can be crazy, right? Because they're triple. Any one of their chaff can threaten that triple. So in theory, you should be able to do really powerful things with Seraphon. It's one of those things where the pieces don't necessarily fit together all that well, even though the individual pieces are quite good. So like a lot of Seraphon is better as allies. For example, the little horsies, they're not horsies, they're like they're chocobo lizards, basically, is what's going on. All the chocobo lizards are good allies. The Star Master is one of the better allies in Order, even though people don't play it very often because it's a little weird and it doesn't look like it belongs in Warcry, but it is really good. There's just a lot that is really there to like about Seraphon. They also have a lot of like their priests are really good as like the Order version of the Chaos Wizards that exist, as far as just like a little wizard that gives you a shooting attack and a cool ability, and it's just like a nice little usable piece, and it can like run around for treasure missions. It's just a very nice little ally that can go into a lot of Order lists that you don't see a lot because I think a lot of people don't know about it, but it is really solid. So again, the Seraphon heroes, very good, but better outside of Seraphon. Even the Seraphon fighters are very good, but they don't fit together well. So someone's going to figure this out. Someone's going to figure out, like a few people have done well in tournaments with Seraphon. Too many people run them for nobody to do well, just like the law of averages. But we haven't found any build really that seems to have repeatable results. But people do well enough with it that I refuse to put them any lower than B. Dark Oath is a little like that too. In theory, Dark Oath has a lot of cool stuff you can do, but anything powerful in Dark Oath, you have to jump through a hoop before you can get it. And so figuring out which sort of hoops you should be aiming for before the tournament is really hard, but it's another one where I wouldn't be surprised if someone kind of cracks it one day and kind of figures out what you're supposed to do with Dark Oath. Or they could be the kind of thing where just like a couple nerfs above them kind of launches them to the forefront of the meta. I wouldn't be surprised at that at all. That happens all the time. We can't go through all of these, but you can kind of get the sense here, right? Like Vulcan Flameseekers have so many tricks. There's just a lot you can do here that is a very different playstyle than what's kind of at the top right now, and kind of structurally the mechanics of Warcry kind of favors those warbands, but there's a lot of really cool design out there. Like some of these are pretty recent, where Vulcan Flameseekers are a recent set of designs. The Reclusian Chamber is a recent set of designs. Thunderstrike has benefited from some more recent designs. I think Ironjaws, the new Ironjaws pieces were recently designed. So there's a lot of really cool, interesting kind of tech that's come out for the game that is in this tier and has a lot of really cool play styles. I think playing the Backstreets Back tier and the Stuck in the Middle with You tier together against each other produces like really awesome games that are really fun. And so that's worth trying out if you do get sick of the top meta. I think the top meta is really fun, but I get why people wouldn't necessarily be as enthused about it as I am. I know different personalities are different, and I do think that this group of warbands, they produce incredible games. Like, I think you should definitely try them out if you are interested, and you can still bring any of these to a tournament and do perfectly well because they do have things that are powerful. The issue is, can you tune any of these to beat 3 of the 5 things that are scary that are out there, right? Like, because if you can figure out how to beat 2 of these things, then you're gonna be able to like hope that you get good matchups and maybe spike a tournament and win and feel great about yourself, right? But if you can figure out how to beat 3 of them, that's when you're cooking with gas. That's when you've created kind of a new archetype that can really elbow its way into the top tier. And that's just like the dream for any brewer, right? So hopefully you give that a shot. And when you do give it a shot, may all your rolls be crits.